Start recording. Hello, everyone. This is the NeuroGuidance Podcast, and I'm Sri Nagubadi, the founder of NeuroGuidance. And our goal is to empower STEM all over the world. And today we have Professor Dang from University of Michigan, and he's going to talk about some of the work he's done related to neurodevelopmental disorders regarding in childhood. And yeah, so thank you, Professor Dang, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so something I want to get into, which is kind of unique, is when I first met you, I believe you said you were from Monte Vista High School, if I'm correct.
Yep, graduated in 1997.
Yeah, so that's the same high school I'm going to right now, later today as a junior. So that's kind
Awesome.
of, yeah, that's kind of cool. So I guess to start, can you talk about like your journey from like Monte Vista to becoming like a doctor and then going on to med school? Like, I'd say what started you or like sparked the process for you?
Sure. So in high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I did a bunch of extracurriculars, speech and debate, mock trial, but I was really interested in science and I loved science. I hated math, but I loved science. I ended up going to Stanford for college and majoring in chemistry, which I loved. And I still didn't really know what I wanted to do in terms of science versus medicine. I come from a family of physicians. And I eventually decided I wanted to do medicine and I wanted to do research too. So then I found out about MD PhD programs, went to Johns Hopkins for that, and did my PhD in neuroscience. Um, and then afterwards matched into residency at University of Michigan, um, in child neurology, because during my medical school years, I really found that I loved working with kids. And there's just a huge amount of discovery that could be done in the child neurology space. So kind of fit well with my career. And then I went into clinical epilepsy and then did a postdoctoral fellowship with my research mentor, Jack Parent, who's an adult epilepsy physician and basic scientist, and then started my own lab after that. So kind
Yeah.
of long story, but basically just made decisions along the way.
Yeah. So I'm doing a bunch of research now too. It's not necessarily related to like neuroscience, it's more related to like cardiology, but how did you really zone in that it was neuroscience? Like I know that could have been like a difficult decision.
That honestly was the easiest decision. I have always been interested in how the brain works and how it forms. So I think early in my career, one of my research mentors asked me, if you're the type of person that wants to learn how the brain works, neuroscience is the way to do that. And of course, there's disease-related neuroscience research, which is what I do now. But at the core of it, I'm interested in how the brain forms and how it works, and that's just the core of what we do in neuroscience.
Hmm. So then like from there, what like connected that with like childhood development disorders and like working with kids?
Working with kids is a lot of fun, just clinically. They tend to be very resilient, they're really funny, and it's really varied in the disease spectrum that you see because the brain's continuously developing during that period of time. So I think the diversity in what we see clinically really matched with the time period of development that I wanted to study in the lab. So with those two things matching together, I ended up in that space. So I think ideally you want your science to match up with what you see clinically so that your research can inform what you do clinically in some ways, but also importantly, your clinical work can inform what questions you ask in the lab. And that really worked out well with childhood epilepsy for me.
Hmm. Got it. So like now moving on to like your research, which we're kind of at, I've done a lot of reading on like some of your papers, and a lot of it has to do with like finding these like specific genes or like cells that cause these developmental disorders, if I'm correct. So what's some like research you found like intriguing or like major discoveries or like realizations you've gained over the past few years of doing this research? If you
So,
like,
yeah.
If you
So
could
my
like
research, sorry, go ahead.
just to like when you're explaining, just to like simplify it down because our audience may
Sure.
not be as scientific.
No, absolutely, for sure. So I think that childhood development and childhood epilepsy research and clinical space is a really exciting time to be part of that space right now. So in the past few decades, with the advent of and availability of next gen sequencing, whole exome, whole genome sequencing for patients, and even just the multi-gene panels, we've really had explosions in discovery of genetic causes of epilepsy and neurodevelopmental disorders. So I'm not actually in the space of discovering the genes, but I'm really interested in learning how those genes, when changed, alter brain development or brain function. So it's kind of functional studies, and the gene discovery aspects have blown up, but the functional studies are honestly hard and take a long time. So those have really lagged behind the gene discovery. But the idea is if we can really find out how these genes, when they're changed, cause disease, we can open up additional targets for therapy, or figure out, if we know what developmental stages or what cell types and what biological processes are affected by the gene variants, then we can address those biological processes. We can give therapies at the correct times to the right cells to have improvements in patients' lives. So there's a lot of gene therapies and kind of gene-directed therapies, or targeted therapies that have been happening in child neurology recently, and I think it's only the tip of the iceberg right now.
And so I kind of have two questions from what you just said. So like the way these like genes like change, I'm in AP Psych right now, so there's this other term we have where it's the idea that the environment you could grow up in can also have some sort of effect or change on your genes. So my first question would be like, how big does like environment play a role, or are these genetic changes more like something that you inherit? And yeah, we can go with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's two different concepts here. One is genetics versus epigenetics. So
Yeah.
genetics are kind of the genetic code that is kind of set. I mean, of course, there are variants or used to be called mutations that happen, um, that can either be inherited or can happen newly in a person where their parents didn't have it. And that's mainly what we study in the lab. We study genetic variants, and we study more specifically genetic variants that have a very strong or high effect size. So there's this idea also that like a single gene, when changed, can cause disease, versus in a lot of other diseases, you have polygenic inheritance or complex inheritance, where you need changes in multiple genes that all kind of add a little bit of an effect, and then together that causes something like autism or schizophrenia
Mm.
or sleep disorders or something like that. We're interested more in a single gene, have a variant that causes epilepsy and severe neurodevelopmental disorders. So those are called um, developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, where the affected individuals have developmental problems as well as epilepsy. The epigenetics part of it is really interesting too. We don't study that much in our lab, but other labs do study that, and that can have that can be where environments or other aspects affect how genes are expressed, or it doesn't affect the actual sequence of the genetics, but it might affect some of the other molecular modifications to your DNA, like methylation or acetylation, to the DNA, and that can cause differences in how those genes are expressed, and those are very important as well. So that might be what you're studying in AP Psych as well.
Yeah. And then is the way that these genes like affect children, is it different for maybe some people like adults per se? Or when do these like genetic mutations actually like start happening?
So a lot of the mutations, some of them are inherited. So, for our studies on this particular rare disease gene, STRAD alpha or strata, those are inherited, where each parent has one altered copy, and then the child that inherits one altered copy from each parent then is affected. So that's what we call autosomal recessive. But a lot of the DEEs are actually what we call de novo mutations. So neither parent really has the mutation, but in the process where either the egg or the sperm is being made, a new mutation happens, and then the child that is produced from that zygote, that union of the sperm and egg, has that mutation and therefore is affected by it.
Okay. Um, so kind of like staying on topic with your results and things like that. Me myself doing research, I understand how hard it is to find like something like novel or groundbreaking and like getting it published. So like in terms of like that process, like obviously when you went to med school, you could have went through like you could have like became a doctor, but you decided to do the MD, PhD and stay close to research. Um, how challenging has research been? And perhaps for a science aspiring student like me, what advice would you give to many others who are willing to go through that research route and understand that it is a difficult process?
It is a really difficult process. I think the most successful scientists are the ones that have a lot of resilience and expect failure, and then celebrate the times when you don't have complete failure. So I mean, it sounds like a very pessimistic thing, but I think that's the reality of experimental science. Um, there's a broad range of what you can do with research, everything, everywhere from fundamental basic science, where you're really studying what the fundamental questions are for biology, chemistry, physics, math, whatever, to applied sciences, where you might be studying more engineering stuff or disease-oriented research, which is kind of the space I lay in, or translational research, where you're really trying to develop therapies. And, so for each of those things, I think you're driven by overlapping but distinct questions. For basic science, for fundamental science, it's really where is our limit of knowledge and what is the most interesting scientific question that I want to pursue going forward. So, that might be like, how does the brain form in a really broad sense, but then you can kind of get into specifics of like, okay, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how we could answer those questions. For disease-oriented or translational research, I think a lot of the questions more come from our patients. So, if you're seeing a patient in clinic and they ask you a question, you're like, I don't really know the answer to that. And no one knows the answer to that. That could be a good research question. Or if it's a patient that has no cure, and they're suffering, and you kind of figure out, okay, well, we know why this patient is affected with disease X. We just don't know, like, we know the genetics behind it, let's say, but we don't know how those genes cause problems. And understanding that might actually open up um, areas to develop new therapies. So that could be a good disease-oriented or translational research that's driven by human need, basically. So I think there's different, depending on where you are in that kind of spectrum of basic to disease-oriented research and in health sciences, at least, then you can ask different questions and find those questions different ways.
Hmm. And so regarding like your discoveries and like things like that, like how much time did it take you? I'd say just to find like one good result and like that whole process, because obviously finding a genetic mutating like gene in your brain would be a pretty advanced process.
Yeah, so um, I think the it can it depends, right? So it depends. You can discover something that no one's ever discovered pretty quickly and be able to publish it if it's, very impactful and groundbreaking and it's novel. Or more often, I think you can spend years, typically 2, 3 years, to gather up the data, 2, 3, 4 years, I'd say, to gather up the data and do all the experiments needed to get a body of, you know, data together to put into a publication. Um, so, and I think, these days, the bar for publication has become higher and higher. And maybe for good reason, because we've had problems with reproducibility and such in the medical sciences and science in general. Um, on the other hand, the technologies that we have to do the experiments are so much more advanced than they were decades ago
Yeah.
that we should be able to produce more data and get results out more quickly. So for our publications that we've had from our lab, I'd say it took about 2, 3 years for each of those. And we're hoping to put out a publication or hoping to submit a publication in the next week or so as well. And it's the product of about 3 years of work.
Wow, that's great. So like regarding your lab and stuff, like obviously you're at the University of Michigan doing all this like work. How do you think it would have been different, like if you're at like maybe a different lab or at a different university? Like how does U Michigan play like a role in your research?
So I think the environment and your mentorship is really important in everything you do. And even though I have a my own lab now, I still have a lot of mentorship and guidance from various people at all different stages, peer mentors as well as more senior mentors. So I think the environment that you're in does shape what you do and how you do it a lot. I honestly may not have done epilepsy research had I not been at Michigan. Michigan has a particularly strong group of epilepsy researchers, and um, finding that mentor kind of directed me toward the space that I'm doing research in now. Same thing when I was in grad school. I chose my mentor's lab more because of what I liked about his mentorship style and where the lab was at. More so, honestly, more than the topic being studied or the techniques being done in that lab. But, of course, everything fit together. I liked the topic and I liked the techniques as well. So I think you can decide based on just the subject matter that you're trying to study, or the people that you want to be surrounded with, or a combination of those two things. So I think, who knows what would have happened if I had, for example, stayed at Hopkins or gone back to California for my residency and for faculty positions. I might have done something altogether different.
Mm. Yeah. So with time coming kind of close, like one final question I wanted to ask you is that you pursued such a long like route of education, undergrad, then med school, and then you did an MD, PhD program. Like, what advice would you give for aspiring like science students? I know you kind of said it earlier, and this is a similar question, but in terms of like building that resilience you were talking about, or maybe daily practices you had during your medical school years, what advice would you give for aspiring scientists?
I think first and foremost, you have to throw yourself in there. So daily practices that distract you from your work and stuff, I think work for a lot of people and are important. Like I liked to go biking, for example, and I still bike to and from work most days when the weather's good. But if you're not really into it, like if you're not living and breathing your science, it can be hard to stay in this position because I think you have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe that it's important, and you should be doing stuff that's important. If you're not doing stuff that's important, then you should probably switch gears. Um, and it takes a lot of time and with a lot of failures. So you have to realize that everything's a learning process. Every failure is a learning process. Uh, and your end goal is something very far away, probably, and there's a lot of steps along the way. So I was told once, if the body of knowledge or research is like the Great Wall of China, most people just want to put one brick on that wall. And it should be a brick that belongs where it is. It's not like a flimsy brick. It should be solid science. It should actually build upon the wall rather than something that can be damaging to the wall and be not reproducible or not true or whatever. So, um, yes, of course, we all want to make breakthrough discoveries. But on the other hand, I think a lot of science is kind of that just what is the next step and how do you build on that wall? Because the timeline of research, science, humanity is really long, right? We are just here for a short period of time. So as long as we're building on that and not detracting from it, I think that's I think that's more than enough for most of us doing medical research.
All right. Thank you, Professor Dang, for all your insights and your whole story. You definitely inspired me and many others watching this. And I wish you good luck with that publication that's coming out next week. And I'd like to thank everyone for watching.
Thanks so much for having me. I haven't said this in a long time, but go Mustangs.